What is up, Steeler fans? Welcome back to another episode of State of the Steelers. I'm your Steel Curtain Network host, Daniel. And today we're going to jump into the website, steelcurtainnetwork.com. We're going to look at some headlines. I'm going to put my Swami hat on, see if we can do some predictions, things of that nature. You know, the draft picks are in. We've talked about the draft picks. We've talked about what and who they are and how they're going to be able to contribute to this team now and in the future. And now, you know, that's been kind of put out there quite a bit. We're going to talk about the website. Now, what I do recommend you guys doing is going to the website. If you have the ability to listen to this while you can, traverse places, maybe do it with me. Go to the website at the same time. But definitely at the end of the show, go to the website, read the articles, because I'm not going to talk about what any specific article is pertaining, just the headlines, in my opinion. And so without further ado, let's get into it. The first headline that I wanted to talk about it's titled, "What Positions Were Surprisingly Missing from the Steelers 2025 Draft Haul?" And this is written by Archie Wilson. A great article. Make sure you guys go and watch it. Get in the comment section. Let him and I and everybody at Steel Curtain Network know who you think was missing out of the draft haul. But for me, I think it was receiver. A lot of receivers were brought in. I do know and I understand that the Steelers traded their second round pick for DK Metcalf. So essentially, they did end up picking up a new receiver using draft capital. However, that's not the same. DK Metcalf is established. He's been in the league for several years. He's been a Pro Bowler. He's an established wide receiver. And, the Steelers are paying him really, really well, handsomely at that, to be that wide receiver number one. Now, there was some rumors and things going on that George Pickens may have been up for trade. I think that there was some talk that the Dallas Cowboys may have been interested in George Pickens. Now, I wasn't too worried or concerned that the Steelers were going to trade away George. And the main reason behind that is last year, they were trying to go out there and get Brandon Ayuk. Now, the 49ers were willing to trade Brandon Ayuk, but they wanted some compensation in return. Typically, preferably a wide receiver. Now, maybe perhaps the Steelers offered George Pickens and the 49ers said, no, we don't want a headache or anything like that. Not saying that he is, but, there's been a lot of smoke to that fire of him having some issues. We've all seen the antics on the sideline, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I digress, but maybe perhaps the 49ers weren't interested in that trade, but I don't think so. So to me, they could have easily have given up George Pickens and acquired Brandon Ayuk last year. So that wasn't the plan. The plan was to bring in another wide receiver to add to the room with George Pickens. And I think that's twofold, right? I think you want to add and build a competition. You think you need to have a wide receiver, that is going to be complementary to your ex and vice versa. But also I think that you want a guy there that maybe can push George Pickens or maybe even be a tier above him. If you were to downgrade George, which in my opinion they did by giving DK Metcalf that bag and trading for him, but you downgrade him from wide receiver 1 to wide receiver 2, I mean, that's got to be a slap to the ego. That's got to be bringing you back down to earth, humbling experience, in my opinion. Now, I know he's not in practice right now or the training that they just recently had. And I think there's some film of him out there practicing and working with somebody called the Rap God. My mistake, the Route God. And, good for him. I mean, he's not just hanging around at the house. You know what I'm saying? He's doing something. It's just he's not with the team, which I understand. He's going through some money things. Now, I don't think the Steelers are going to give him an extension this year. I don't, before the season. I don't think that the Steelers are going to pay him. I think that there's been a lot of red flags, and mainly, I mean, there's the off-field stuff, but there's also some of the things on field. Like, a lot of people have pointed out the lack of a hustle, the maybe even perhaps, on routes where he's not maybe the target, maybe he's running the wrong routes. He's not supposed to be where he's supposed to be at. And it's causing issues with the other wide receivers and tight ends because now their routes are being affected because George isn't where he was supposed to be. And, hopefully having a wide receiver 1 in the room like a DK Metcalf can kind of shake that. But, wide receiver, they brought in a few. They ended up not picking up any. They got one in free agency, Robert Woods, an older guy, an Allen Robinson type, I think. The Steelers have always had a very veteran wide receiver, Jericho Cottree, in the building, those type of guys and these are the guys that were in the building when they were successful. You had a veteran receiver who been there, done that, who, Robert Woods is that guy. He's got a Super Bowl ring. So you bring him in, he kind of, is an example of what you need to do to get to where you want to be at. And perhaps you're hoping that some of these younger guys, like your George Pickens, your Roman Wilsons of the world, maybe even Calvin Austin, who's already been there for a few years now himself, can look up and say, all right, if I want to get to, the promised land, get the Pittsburgh, their 7th Lombardi, we need to, maybe perhaps do the things that this guy is saying and or showing because he's been there. The next article I want to talk about is the Steelers burning question: who wins Rookie of the Year in 2025? This is written by our editor, Jeff Hartman. Make sure you go in there, check it out, right in the comment section there, who you think is going to be the Rookie of the Year. Now, this is where we put our little Swami hat on and we're trying to predict some things, right? I think a lot of people are going to look at Caleb Johnson as a guy who potentially is going to be the front runner. He's an offensive guy. He's going to be given the ball a lot. I think Mike Tomlin had mentioned that he was a heavy load guy, right? That he can take on a heavy load. He's got that body physique, and not saying that Jaylen Warren isn't. He's a smaller guy, and he's his center of gravity is lower to the ground, so he's hard to tackle and he bounces off people. But last year he dealt with some injuries. Hopefully that was just a 1-year thing. This year I expect the Steelers to see a heavy dose of both, or showcase both Jaylen Warren and Caleb Johnson. I think they're going to be the primary running backs for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and with that, you're probably expecting to see maybe perhaps Caleb Johnson getting that Rookie of the Year. Now, Derek Harmon, he's got an issue with one of his rotator cuffs. It was partially torn or something of that nature. I don't know how that's going to have an effect on him in the beginning of the year or throughout training camp or any of those things. I'm hoping it has no bearing on anything. I know that's part of the reason why he fell. He was considered a risk because of that injury. But this guy has the capabilities of being a very good player. He really flashed last year in Oregon, and given his size and measurables and metrics, it's no surprise that the Steelers were not willing to move back when he was on the board there at 21, and they ended up grabbing him. I do think that if he goes out there, he can showcase, be a run stopper, because at the end of the day, I think everybody remembers how gashed the Pittsburgh Steelers were last year through the run, especially in that playoff game against the Baltimore Ravens. And I think if you have a guy like him, maybe even Sawyer, who's solidifying the edge when TJ and Alex Highsmith have to take a break, so that way it's not becoming a target point for the offense against the defense, then I think that can all look as, hey, this number 1 pick, this guy, he's doing his thing. No matter who's out there, the run is being stopped, and maybe he's going to be a big contributor to that. I really do think so. But I also think that stopping the run is an entire front thing, and I think the Steelers made some really good moves with that. But if he can create some splash, create some forced fumbles, some sacks, he doesn't have to have a lot. He doesn't have to have double digits sacks. He's an interior defensive lineman. He's not an edge. So I think that could really, really propel him up there for a possibility. But in the end, I do think it's going to end up being Caleb Johnson who probably wins this, as long as everybody stays healthy, obviously. The guy's got a lot of speed and burst. There's one thing that I noticed that the Pittsburgh Steelers were looking at when they were acquiring, or not necessarily acquiring, but when they were bringing in running backs, checking them out. The running backs that they were bringing in were the running backs that had a home run ability, and Caleb Johnson definitely does. I think he has hit 22 miles an hour while playing. And, I know the 40-yard dash wasn't the most impressive, but, I don't know what type of training he went into that. The 40-yard dash is something that a lot of people have to specifically train for. It's if you don't, it's you're not going to be out there running as fast as the time that you possibly could. And somebody who may be slower than you because they have the techniques and the form right of the get up or the get out of the stance, you may end up showcasing a slower time than what you are when you're playing, because at the end of the day, nobody's standing in those positions. Nobody's waiting for, your mark, get, set, go, or whatever, that type of thing to run in a straight line. And form in those situations while you're carrying a football isn't, it's all different. It's all different. You have pads, you have weight. I think it was Dave maybe who said that the 40-yard dash should be run in pads and helmets and cleats. And I think they're right. That's a true test of how fast the player is if you have them in full gear. And because I don't know, I've never seen a Sunday game where somebody's running on down the sideline in just shirts and shorts. You know what I mean? There's more to it. So it's a good test. It's a good thing to see how fast people are, but I don't think it should be the be all end all when it comes to deciding somebody's speed and ability, especially if you have tape where there's people that can't catch him. And I think we see that. But that 4.57 that he ran at the combine is probably a good reason why he fell to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And well, I couldn't be more pleased. I'm glad he did. Well, guys, we're going to take a quick break. When we get back, we got more to talk about. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after a few minutes. Thank you for sticking with us. Before we get back into the content, well, we are talking about SteelCurtainNetwork.com, but I want to make sure you check it out because it's our one-stop shop for Pittsburgh Steelers news and coverage. If there's any and every breaking news, you're going to find it there. So be up to date, up to the minute on your Pittsburgh Steelers news at SteelCurtainNetwork.com. All right, so let's get back into it. So the next article that we're going to talk about, or the headline, is no, the Pittsburgh Steelers 2026 compensatory picks are not set. This is written by Dave Schofield. I highly recommend you go in there and check out what Dave had to say about why it's not set and his opinion about the compensatory picks. What I'm going to talk about is, well, as of now, the Steelers are predicted to get about 4 compensatory picks. Now, if the players who they have lost play the amount of time that they are expected to play and there's no injuries, the Steelers will have a couple thirds, maybe a fourth and like a fifth or something like that, which is huge. I mean, you can do a lot of things. And I personally don't think that the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to go into next year's draft and try to draft like 10 to 12 players. It's not realistic. I think that they're going to try to position themselves to move up. Now, what round and where and for who, that's going to be the big question mark. Now, the Steelers have brought in quite a few quarterbacks for this past draft and end up landing Will Howard, which we're going to talk about him in the next segment, in the 6th round. That's more of a lottery ticket. And it also seems more like because he waited to the 6th round, and it also may be a reflection of how poor the class may have been, and the Steelers maybe not wanting to overreact like they did maybe in 2022 when they end up drafting Kenny Pickett in the 1st round and not another quarterback went for 3 rounds or into the 3rd round. But I digress. We saw the Jacksonville Jaguars move up to 2, and we saw what it costed them to do so. So it might be expensive to move up into the top 10. And, I don't think the Steelers or anybody wants the Steelers to tank. That's not a thing. Now, I do know that some teams have moved up from very high. I think it was the Chiefs that moved up from the mid-20s down to about 11 or something like that, almost or 10 to get into the top 10 for Patrick Mahomes. Now, Patrick Mahomes wasn't seen as this generational talent or any of this or that. Coming out, I think a lot of people were shocked initially that the Chiefs were willing to move up that high for Patrick Mahomes. And it had nothing to do with his play or anything like that. It's just you can't predict sometimes these things. I mean, when it comes to the quarterback position, it's very dependent also like on the receivers and the scheme and talent that you're going against. I mean, it's kind of hard to determine who's going to be a success and who's not. Sometimes it's really a surprise. You just gotta have to do a lot of homework there. But and even at that, I mean, these teams do their homework, and a lot of times they get it wrong. It's a very, very difficult position to, I guess, to predict what's going to happen. You know what I mean? Well, anywho, they moved up. They gave up some they give up some capital. It's going to be a high price tag, but I think the Steelers have positioned themselves pretty good to be able to pay that price. And what I mean by that is you don't want to pay that price if the rest of the team isn't ready. If you have question marks in a bunch of different places, you have holes in a bunch of different places, you really can't give up future picks that could fill in those holes if you have holes. And so I think the Steelers have done a really good job, solidifying the offense and defensive line. They've drafted Keanu Benton recently. They've drafted here recently Derek Harmon in this last draft. Yaya Black, as well as another guy that was drafted. I think he's going to have a potential to make his presence out there as the nose tackle. Martavius Adams was dropped, so it seems like he's probably going to get a bulk of those snaps at nose tackle. It's just that the Steelers hardly ever play in those positions, but I think he's going to have a huge role against certain teams, against certain players like the Ravens and teams that have that sort of running philosophy. But I digress. So you've solidified the defensive line. I think you've already solidified the offensive line. I know there's some question marks because you've had Roderick Jones on the wrong side, and he had a questionable year last year, but now he's on his more quote unquote natural side, which I'm hoping will bring a better performance out of him. He needs to. I mean, this is going to be a big year for him. At the end of this year, going into next year, the Steelers are going to have to decide whether or not they want to sign that 5th-year option for his going into his 4th year, for his 5th year, and he's going to have a big year 3 if he wants to get that done. Fautanu, he was injured all last year. He played in one game. I thought he played well in that one game, but he only played one game, and we haven't seen him back from the injury, and so there's a question mark there. But if he comes back as he was, and Zach Frazier takes the necessary steps forward, doesn't regress, I mean, this offensive line is probably going to be a lot better than it was, and in a really good position to be better, being a really good offensive line. Isaac Seumalo got injured last year with the Pack. Who knows how that may have affected him throughout the entire year? If it did have an effect, if it was a lingering effect, because to me, honestly, he had a down year. And, now that he's healthy, if he can be what he was the year before, I mean, that's a huge, huge plus, especially now with Zach Frazier and Roderick Jones on that side. On the opposite side, Fautanu coming in there, Mason McCormick maybe having a second year now, or a first year under his belt, going into a second year. If he can take a step forward, I mean, he doesn't have to be a superstar there. I think that, Zach Frazier, he's amazing. And if Fautanu, he was probably the most polished lineman up until his injury last year, which included Zach Frazier. If he can be on that pace or in that trajectory still, then that's really going to help out a Mason McCormick having those two guys around him. And so, this offensive line, the defensive line is getting solidified. The wide receiver position, DK Metcalf, George Pickens, if they can make that work, which is a big question mark, because these are two guys who have a lot of personality and a lot of competitiveness, a lot of I want the ball, I want to make a difference, right? And so that's going to be a question mark. Now, I think the Steelers have, they've answered the running back position. Tight end, I don't think there's a huge question mark there. Pat Freiermuth, I think he's solid. He's probably got to work on his blocking a little bit more, but I think he's gotten better over time. I think you got to get the ball more to Darnell Washington. But overall, when you look at this offense, I think they're capable. They're definitely capable to be led into playoff games and atmospheres and win those games, and maybe perhaps even go further and put some more hardware into the trophy case. It's just that one position that is a question mark, which is the quarterback position, which goes back to these compensatory picks. I strongly suspect that they're going to try to utilize those to move up in the draft next year. Next year's draft is supposed to be have a lot more depth at the quarterback position for potential picks early on in next year's draft. Next year's draft is in the city of Pittsburgh, so it would be I don't want to say nice, but it'd be a fairy tale storytelling type of thing for the Steelers to be able to draft their next franchise QB in the city of Pittsburgh. And I think that is what Omar Khan's plan is probably today. Now that's not Mike Tomlin's plan. I mean, maybe perhaps he has some sort of idea, and obviously he's probably saying, yeah, that's good. But his plan is always, how am I going to get the Steelers to the promised land this year? And the quarterback position is still a question mark. Steelers have Mason Rudolph, who I think can start, and I'd like to see what he can do, especially with the talent around him now. Aaron Rodgers is a guy that hasn't signed yet, but all indications seem like he's probably going to sign. Um, but the Steelers, they end up selecting Will Howard, and I guess we can talk about him now and his expectations of of Will Howard. And there was a article written by Chris Gillis called or titled "Expectations of Will Howard" on the website. So make sure you go and check that out. Yeah, he's a lottery ticket. It's a low risk, high reward, potential. He's a national championship winner, so he can win, he can lead. I think he has the intangibles. He dropped for a reason. His combine wasn't the most impressive. He was a little bit inaccurate. A lot of people question his strength. I don't know. I'd have to watch him a little bit more. He kind of, he's not a Patrick Mahomes or Aaron Rodgers in his youth that's going to be able to make these off-platform throws all over the place. But I don't think he's anywhere near I don't think his arm is below average or anything like that. I think he has an NFL arm. He takes what the defense will give you. And I think that there's a stigma when you play for a team like Ohio State, where you have wide receivers and running backs and an offensive line that are probably going to be playing professional football for a few years, that it makes it too easy for the quarterback. But my thing is, it's hard to predict. And again, it goes back to hard to predict, because if you had an excellent quarterback, right, and you put a lot of good people around them, you would expect them to succeed. You expect them to win a national championship. It's if you take that same quarterback and you put them in a less favorable situation, you would expect them to succeed, but you can't put everything on them to win that national championship like that. So he went out there to win the national championship. So he checkmarked that box, um, in my opinion, at least. So I'm excited to see what he has. This year, as far as his expectations, my expectation for him is to learn and to play a lot during preseason. He's going to be buried in the depth chart. He's going to be behind Mason Rudolph. He's going to be third. I don't think he's going to beat out Mason. I don't think the Steelers want to put that pressure there either, right? Last time they put Kenny Pickett there, mainly because I think the fans had a lot to do with that, to be honest with you. I think that Mason would have been QB2 behind Mitch Trubisky. But remember, preseason, people were booing him and stuff. Imagine if Mitch got benched and it was Mason Rudolph that came in against the Jets, what that season could have looked like. And also the next one. But I digress. I don't think they would have kept Kenny on the bench the full time. They gave him they drafted him in the first round. He was going to be their guy eventually. But I digress. So I'm okay with Mason. Aaron Rodgers, if he comes in, I think he's better than Mason Rudolph. I think he's better than Will Howard. He's probably going to be the best quarterback, but how much better? I couldn't tell you, and for how long will he be better? Right. Because I think that if it was week one, and everybody's 100% healthy, no bumps and bruises, he hasn't gotten sacked, yeah, Aaron Rodgers is going to be better. But week 6, after he's been hit a few times, bumps, bruises, maybe dealing with some hamstring stuff or whatever, because I think that was one of the things that he was dealing with last year and why he wasn't so, so great early on, and he kind of got a little bit better towards the end of the season once the injury started to die, started to calm down. You have to take that into consideration, because those injuries can flare up at any time. It's a contact sport, so you can get hit in week 16 and now you got a problem. You know what I mean? And so, like I said, if I was going into the playoffs, both of them everybody was healthy, I'd obviously be choosing Aaron Rodgers. But if I had to look at a 17-game season and say, hey, who do you think is going to be able to make it throughout there and still be able to push in the playoffs? It's hard to say not Aaron Rodgers, but it's that gap between it's Aaron Rodgers in the playoffs to having to go a full season Aaron Rodgers and like maybe any other quarterback, that gap shrinks a little bit because you have to look at the totality of the entire season. But Will Howard, my expectations for him is to learn. I think that if he finds himself on the field, it's obviously not a good reason. I think that Aaron Rodgers probably got hurt and either Mason's not playing well or he's also injured. But I don't see the Steelers taking Aaron off the field at all this year if he ends up signing, regardless of how he plays, good or bad. Mike Tomlin has the thing about respect and stuff. He may be able to pull the trigger pretty quickly for some of these quarterbacks, but these quarterbacks that he was able to pull the trigger on, like Mason Duck, Mitch Trubisky, Kenny Pickett, none of those guys were established. He didn't pull the plug on Ben Roethlisberger. And there was times where he looked injured, and I think down 2020 when they were going 11-0, and then they kind of fumbled a little bit. That was the COVID year. I was actually there in Dallas for that game against the Cowboys, and Ben got hit in the side of the knee, and he came out. Mason came in for a couple plays. I think in the second half, Ben came back, but he was already not very mobile. But after that game, he was very immobile. And, although the Steelers were winning, it was like, it don't look the same. And a lot of that had to do with Ben Roethlisberger. And that knee in that situation where he got hit in the knee just never looked like it healed correctly. Or not necessarily healed correctly. That didn't look like he didn't heal enough for it not to bother him in the regular season. I mean, it's like, I used to be in the military, and when I went to the Army, about 3 weeks before I actually sprained my ankle before I went to basic training. My ankle was still a little bit swollen when I got there, but it was almost healed. And because I never really let it heal all the way, it stayed swollen the entire time I was at basic training. It wasn't until I got some time to rest and relax it a few months later that it finally went back to normal. But for the longest time, it was swollen, and it was just so much pain. And that's because I wouldn't let it heal. Now, obviously, I wasn't a high performance athlete with the greatest of medical medicine, the best that medicine has to offer at my side. But like a professional athlete would. But yeah, if you don't let those things, if you continue to go out there and you're playing in those, on a sprained ankle or on something, it's gonna prolong the injury before you can let it heal. And so, but that's what I got for you guys today, man. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Like, comment, subscribe. Make sure you guys go and check out the website and read the articles for yourself, and put it in the comments section what you guys think. But with that being said, I'm out of here, guys. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.